Close your eyes for a moment. You're standing in the cold marshes of Italy in the year 421 AD. There is no glittering Piazza San Marco, no canals glowing under lantern light, only the sharp sea wind against your skin, a few fragile huts built on wooden stakes, and hundreds of refugees fleeing from barbarian invaders. A small child looks up at his father and whispers, "How can we survive in a place with no land? Nothing but water and mud." And you, carrying the mindset of the 21st century, have just stepped into this moment, witnessing it all. In the next 20 minutes, we won't just retell the story of Venice, we'll step inside it, uncovering how people turned an impossible swamp into a mighty empire at sea. You'll discover hidden secrets of engineering, trade, and politics that made Venice thrive. And when the story ends, you'll walk away with timeless lessons: how to turn adversity into strength, and how a small community can leave an immortal mark on history. 1. Venice, a city built on water, engineering. Miracle or disaster in slow motion? The question is, how do you build something permanent on shifting mud? Their solution was as ingenious as it was crazy. They drove millions of wooden stakes into the ground, almost like making a giant forest beneath the water. Each pole was hammered deep into clay until it hit a harder layer. Then platforms were placed on top, and stone buildings rose above the lagoon. Here's the twist. Most people don't realize the wood didn't rot. Why? Because submerged in water, without oxygen, it mineralized over centuries. In a sense, those wooden stakes turned into stone. Today, when you walk through Venice, you're literally stepping on an ancient artificial foundation, an invisible forest holding up palaces and cathedrals. Think of it like America's Hoover Dam or New York's skyscrapers. Venice was pulling off something equally jaw-dropping, but with medieval tools. Now, let's compare. Other Italian cities like Florence or Milan built on solid ground. They grew tall, expanded easily, and fortified their walls. Venice chose the hard way, an unstable lagoon, vulnerable to tides and storms, and yet, that crazy choice gave them natural defense. Armies couldn't march through water. Raiders avoided the swamp. What looked like weakness became strength. Of course, there were costs. Venice has always been sinking, slowly, centimeter by centimeter. Combine that with modern problems like rising sea levels and groundwater pumping in the 20th century, and the city has become a symbol of fragility. Here's the small lesson for us today. Sometimes the boldest innovation comes from saying, "Yes, this is impossible, but let's try anyway." Venice wasn't born out of comfort. It was born out of crisis. And it teaches us that you can turn your disadvantages, whether it's muddy ground or a difficult season in life, into your strongest defenses. But building on water is only half the story. Engineering can give you walls and houses, but it can't give you order. The next question for the Venetians was even harder. How do you keep people together? Imagine hundreds of families packed onto islands, each with their own power struggles, ambitions, and fears. If the city collapsed into infighting, no amount of wooden stakes could hold it up. And that takes us to the second miracle of Venice, not about bricks and mortar, but about people and power. 2. Wealth, power, and decay. How Venice ruled the seas, but lost the war of time. Once Venice had solved the puzzle of where to live, the next challenge was how to thrive. And here's where Venice truly shines. The sea became its highway, and trade became its heartbeat. Picture yourself on a Venetian ship in the 13th century. The sails are billowing. The hold is packed with silk from China, spices from India, and glassware made right in Venice. While most medieval Europeans barely traveled beyond their villages, Venice was running a global business before global business was even a phrase. At its peak, Venice wasn't just a city. It was an empire of trade routes, stretching across the Mediterranean and into the Middle East. Think of it as the Wall Street of the Middle Ages. Money, ships, and contracts flowed through the lagoon like lifeblood. But with wealth came power. The Doge's palace glittered. Merchants became nobles. Art and music flourished. To many outsiders, Venice looked untouchable, like the New York City of its time. Here's the catch. Venice had built its entire identity on one card, the sea. And when that card began to slip, so did the empire. When Portugal and Spain discovered new routes around Africa and into the Atlantic, Venice's monopoly on Eastern trade cracked. Imagine running the world's best video rental store the day Netflix came online. That's the shock Venice faced. And they didn't adapt fast enough. The city still had wealth, still had prestige, but it was living off yesterday's victories. Slowly, decay set in. Palaces still gleamed, but the empire's influence waned. Here's a small lesson for us today. Success is never permanent. You can be the leader of your industry, the strongest player in your field. But if you stop innovating, if you rely only on what once worked, you risk fading into nostalgia. Yet Venice didn't disappear completely. Even in decline, it reinvented itself, not as a military or trade superpower, but as a cultural beacon. And that shift takes us to the last part of this story. The Venice we know today, still breathtaking, still fragile, and now facing its greatest modern test. 3. Venice today. Beauty, fragility, and the price of survival in the modern world. If you step into Venice today, it feels like walking into a painting that somehow came to life. Gondolas slide silently under bridges, sunlight dances on the water, and centuries-old palaces rise like stage sets. For millions of visitors, Venice is not just a city, it's a dream. But here's the truth. Dreams are fragile. Behind the postcard views, Venice is fighting for its very survival. The same lagoon that once protected it is now its greatest threat. Rising sea levels, storm surges, and the infamous Acqua Alta floods regularly swallow entire piazzas. Imagine living in New Orleans or Miami, but with thousand-year-old buildings that can't just be rebuilt with concrete and steel. And then there's tourism. Every year, more than 20 million visitors pour into a city with fewer than 50,000 residents. Picture Times Square. But every street, every bridge, every cafe is just as packed. Locals often feel like actors on a stage, their real lives pushed aside by the constant flood of outsiders. Some Venetians are leaving, and every year the resident population shrinks a little more. The irony? Tourism keeps Venice alive financially, but is also slowly suffocating its soul. Cruise ships tower over fragile canals. Souvenir shops replace bakeries. The city risks becoming more of a museum than a community, and yet there's resilience here too. The massive Meuse Flood Barrier Project, decades in the making, now stands guard against the sea. Local groups fight to preserve traditional crafts like glassblowing in Murano and lace making in Burano. Younger Venetians are experimenting with ways to balance modern life and ancient heritage, like ecotourism, digital workspaces, and cultural festivals that serve locals as much as tourists. For Americans watching, maybe this feels familiar. Cities like New Orleans or Charleston wrestle with balancing history, tourism, and climate change. Venice is simply a more dramatic, visible version of the same struggle. Here's the lesson Venice whispers to us today. Survival isn't just about strength. It's about balance. Balance between protecting what's sacred and adapting to what's coming. Between opening your doors to the world and keeping a home for your own people. Between honoring the past and daring to change for the future. Venice has lived for over 1,600 years. It has outlasted empires, plagues, and wars. And now, as we stand at the edge of the 21st century, its survival depends not just on Venetians, but on all of us. On how we value culture, history, and the fragile beauty of the human story. So the next time you see a photo of Venice, don't just think of romance and gondolas. Think of resilience. Think of the cost of keeping beauty alive. And ask yourself, what do we choose to preserve, and at what price? And so, Venice's story comes full circle. From a handful of refugees building homes on wooden stakes in the mud, to an empire of trade and culture, to today, a fragile jewel balancing between survival and loss. If there's one lesson Venice leaves us with, it's this. What looks impossible can be made real, and what seems eternal can vanish if we don't protect it. Now, I'd love to hear from you. If you could step back into Venice's history with modern knowledge, what would you change? Would you reinforce the city's foundations, reshape its politics, or find a new way to balance its future? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. And if this journey through Venice sparked something in you, please give this video a like, subscribe for more time travel adventures, and share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. Because history isn't just behind us. It's a guide waiting to be rediscovered. Together.